want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and we're going to kind of go through a little bit of the history of where we've come from and kind of where a recommendation from the Boundary Committee and a lot of factors that have kind of entered in along the way as we've gone through a process this fall. Here's our Boundary Committee, which started in October, meeting on a regular basis. And as we started to meet, there was a lot of factors that kind of kept feeding in along the way. And once we started picking up speed, so to speak, we started having some longer meetings along the way as well. But we had original goals of the committee were to develop short-term solutions to address the overcrowding at North and Explorer. Those was one of our primary, more immediate goals. One of the things that we said early on is we did not want to put students through two changes. We wanted to make sure that whatever we did, we didn't have to do again the following year or in the short term. We wanted to look at something more of a long-term view. We also wanted to make sure that we drew the new elementary boundaries for when Elementary 7 opens. And the goal was to develop 2 or 3 options to bring forward to the public. So that was when we originally started, that's what we stated as our goals. What changed along the way? Very early on, in fact, going back to last spring, we knew we had a wet year. Obviously, the last 2 years have been the wettest years on record in our area here. And so that was one of the factors that was starting to play on our timetable, as well as the fact that we did have a wet site in Elementary 7 as well. So as literally hundreds of loads of sand were brought into that site, we were trying to get started, and we just didn't get out of the gates very, very quickly at all with Elementary 7. We had a record enrollment increase of 350 students that came into our hallways and classrooms starting in August. So that was a factor that kind of entered into the equation as well. And then we had the recognition of dramatic high school enrollment growth rate. I think we've known for some time that we were going to have a ramp up of high school enrollment, and that's why we're in the midst of a building project with an addition at the high school that will add about a capacity of 450 students, take us to approximately 1,650 capacity when the new addition is complete with the freshman academy that's currently being constructed. And then we had time constraints to deal with. And so as we recognized that dramatic high school enrollment growth, we started to see that not only would we increase about 166 is what the number we're projecting for next year at the high school. That's with no growth within the classes that are rolling up, but just by rolling grades forward, 166 student increase, we started to recognize really quickly that that growth was going to be dramatic, and in 3 years, we were going to be full with the addition completed there. So that started to be a time constraint, as well as looking at number 7 and trying to figure out how we're going to deal with this. So our scope started to change as we started to meet. This chart shows the gold line in the bottom is taking our classes next year, 2021, 1,298 students, is if we just simply take grades 8 through 11 and roll them forward. And we're just accounting for no additional growth, just rolling those classes forward. And you can see 3 years out, we've got a line at 23, 24. Rolling them forward at that time, it would be 1,694. We're talking about a capacity of 1,650. And the top line is if we took a 5% compounded annually growth rate within those grades. And so you can see where the maroon line goes on the top side. In 3 years, we'd be at 2059, and you can see the growth rate, how that outpaces if we have growth within those classes. Use 5% because the last couple years we've been right around 5%. If you go back 10 years, the internal growth rate within those classes is more like 9.5%. So we think we're pretty conservative in saying 5% is something we can project that is a very real possibility. Although, if you look at our elementary classes have not grown that dramatically over the last several years. They are much higher enrollments than our high school classes, but they're not the dramatic growth rate that we saw for a while there. And so that is some numbers that we also factored in along the way. Middle school enrollment. As we started to look at these numbers, we also started to have conversations about middle school because one of our goals was to try and address that overcrowding at North. In 2010, you can see here 509. In 2013, which is the second year, 701. 2016, 913. And then this year we're at 1247. So those are our 4 snapshots that we looked at, and you can see the enrollment within the grades 6, 7, and 8 as well that make up our middle school enrollment. And so we started to recognize that this is the growth rate we're on. I don't know that we'll continue to see that dramatic of increase, but we know we're going to see an increase in the middle school as well, and with the overcrowding that we're already experiencing, that led to some of our discussions. Some of these numbers, especially the high school numbers, were brought into the equation at the September 9th board meeting. I know Kello and some of the media picked up on that because it really was more of a, boy, this is coming a little quicker than what at least I sure anticipated, and I wasn't aware of that coming into the position, that it would be within 3 years that we'd have to really look at something in a pretty significant hurry. So those were other factors. New information along the way. As we talked about some of this, the construction delay and the recognition of the short time frame is what we just talked about. City growth projections had several information sharing things along the way that we had with the City of Sioux Falls. I had the opportunity to meet with them to talk about their growth management plan, where growth may be occurring, the areas where it may be occurring, where they anticipate growth, and sewer ability obviously is one of the major factors where growth is going to occur. And so those types of things entered into some of our conversations, the middle school, high school discussions that we talked about. And then really these last 2 things were major impacts. Not only what we wanted things to look like in 1 year, but what do we want them to look like in 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years out. What we decide really this year with some of these decisions will impact the district for literally decades to come. And so we started to have more long-term conversations, and that was not part of that original scope as well. And I'll kind of explain why that was the case in just a couple minutes. Guide K-12 software is a software package that we purchased here in the fall. As we started to get into these conversations, we started to look for software, and we looked into a couple different software packages. Very quickly found that Guide K-12 gave us, it's a really powerful tool that allowed us to download all of our student information data and bring that into the equation so we could look at every kind of demographic that we'd want to look at, from your socioeconomic status to gender to race to all of those types of factors as we bring that into where do you draw boundary lines and have some diversity within our schools. So those were things that also got brought into the equation along the way. That took a little longer than I think at least I anticipated. I thought, well, we'll look at this, we'll kick some tires, make some decisions on which is the best software, but it was really a kind of a complex process in that it took some time to download all the data and to really then do some training. Thanks to Mr. Christofferson, he's so adept with this. We actually finished the training today, but he was able to use the software program and really didn't feel like we were behind the 8 ball at all. But it really wasn't until later in the fall that we really started to delve into the use of the K-12 software. Along the way, we talked about what other districts with similar growth patterns have done. And there's 4 different districts that I had conversations with and were able to share with the committee some of the information that we learned from them. They have been where we are at. They're all districts closer to that 10 to 11,000, double our size. And if you think that's a long ways off, it really isn't as far off as we probably anticipate, especially when you look at doubling enrollment. We were 750 roughly back in 2001. Here we are today at almost 5,200 students, and so we've grown almost 7 times in those 20 years. Now, these districts, West Fargo, North Dakota is a little over 11,000. West Des Moines and Waukee, Iowa are both the same. Waukee is west of West Des Moines, and they're both real growth areas as well. Waukee is a growth area now, where West Des Moines has been more stagnant. They've kind of experienced their growth and they've kind of leveled off. But those are districts we talked to. Shakopee, Minnesota, the reason that's up here is starting last year, there was a group of our district personnel and board members that went to Shakopee to learn what they had done over there. And to share what Shakopee did, they had floated a bond issue for a new high school, a second high school, several years back, and that was for $89 million bond issue. The taxpayers voted it down and said, we don't want a second high school, we want to stay one high school. We want to stay one, and that was something they felt was important in their community. They came back with a bond issue of $139 million, and it passed right through. That capacity is estimated to be 3,000 in that current high school. Today, there are around 2,700 students in that Shakopee High School. And so we looked at what they did, because the concept that they used was really an academy model. And the academies, they've got 7 different academies, including a freshman academy, and then they broke it up by disciplines. They had a science and technology academy and several other academies. So students stayed within those academies for the most part. They could still take classes outside the academy, but for the most part they were within that, and they tried to have a smaller school feel within a very large high school. Today at 2,700, they're struggling now with the idea of what do we do next when we fill that up. And so they are still faced with what's the next step. So we looked at those, and that factored into our conversations along the way as well. These are options discussed. I mentioned the delay of Elementary 7, and by October, we really were of the realization that it's a foregone conclusion that Elementary 7 was not going to be able to be opened next year in August. To open something in the middle of the year, we also realized it was going to be very difficult to do, because you'd have to bring a whole new staff in the middle of the year. In a school district with 7 elementary schools, it's just something that wasn't really realistic for us to do. So those were things that, as we came to that realization, we said, now we really do have a little additional time for the long-term boundary, but we still have the short-term considerations. And you can't really deal with one without dealing with the other, because we didn't want to have boundaries changed a couple times. And so complexities of our conversation kept adding along the way. If you throw in also the situation that we have different pathways within our school community, we've got the personalized learning, but not every school offers every pathway. And so that was also added into some of our conversations and made it a little more complicated as to know just how do you proceed with recommendations. So we looked at all kinds of different options. The idea was to come down again to 2 or 3. The option, first of all, was the most obvious, to redraw K-5 district boundary lines. The K-5 boundary lines was just the thing that we originally started out, and it still today is one of those that I think make as much sense as anything. But option B was to reconfigure grade spans, and that is to take JK, K, and 1, and then 2, 5. And it fit well within our curriculum, and you can have more collaboration. There's some efficiencies as well. And so your 7 buildings would be split between 3 and 4. if you were to look at options like that. Again, it didn't address anything with the overcrowding of a middle school, but yet it does give you probably some conversations of pros and cons from an academic standpoint, and we delved into that. Option C, you can see the different grade spans there. This is one of those that didn't get a whole lot of attention with the committee for various reasons, but and there's some inefficiencies and busing and everything else. This is one of those that didn't last long as we talked about the pros and cons. Option D, you can see different configurations here again. This also didn't probably get a whole lot of attention as we went along the pathway of discussions. Option E was K2, 3, 5. Because the way our curriculum is set up, and especially with our personalized learning, it wasn't a natural split for what we're currently doing. It didn't fit our current culture and our current educational model very well. Option F, this one started to gain a lot of attention. It did address the overcrowding by removing 6th grade from our middle schools, and we do know that there are some successful models like this in South Dakota. But it is interesting when you go back and you start looking at assessment data within this model that it doesn't necessarily have a real positive impact upon the achievement. And so for various reasons, we started to more gravitate away from this at the end, but it had a lot of discussion around this particular option. Option G is another one that gained a lot of attention and is one that we felt was a viable option. And again, it did take that 6th grade out of the middle schools and would really create a lot of space within those schools. So then, option H, this is a little bit of a hybrid model where we started talking about our current grade configuration, but having magnet schools within those grade configurations. And again, that's something eventually we steered away from, but we did have some pretty rich conversation surrounding that. So I think you can see we tried to do our due diligence along the way in everything that we discussed and really tried to make sure that we looked at all options. We didn't leave any stones unturned, I don't believe, along the way. And then what we did is we wanted to come back and with the pros and cons of each option and reduce the options down to what were these 3 as of just a few weeks back. So the 3 that we were going to present to the community, to the board, were option A, the redrawing K5 boundary lines, option F, that we just talked about, and then option G. We never got down to actually saying, okay, which are our top 2, but it really appeared to be the top 2 are the A and the G on the left-hand side. As we started to talk about it, we started to say, boy, we really, as a committee, felt that the real option that everybody was most satisfied with was option A, just redrawing the K5 lines.
So the considerations that led to the recommendations that we're going to share with you this evening that are coming to you from the committee were the following. Back when I originally was able to be hired for this position, and prior to coming on board back in April, we did a SWOT analysis, and the SWOT survey gave us a lot of valuable information. That information gave us the strengths, weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats that our staff felt were important for us to consider moving forward as a district. Much of that information was information we referenced as a committee in coming with these recommendations. Part of that information included the positive culture that we have here in the Harrisburg School District. And there's really a belief that that has really come from and has grown from a small school feel, and that we've grown from a small school district, and we've tried to maintain that small school feel, and relationships are really the pillar and the key toward keeping that small school feel. And in keeping with that, we believe that a 6-8 grade span can help support this by allowing staff to get to know students better over 3 years rather than 2 years, and by limiting the number of transitions that students would have to go through. Along the way, I had the opportunity to meet with the City of Sioux Falls on a couple of different occasions. We took their growth projections and their growth management map and where they felt growth would be occurring and when they felt growth would be occurring in different areas. That data and information was also factored into the recommendations that will be presented to you tonight as well. We also believe that the recommendations that we will share with you allowed for keeping the current course programming and pathways intact, and by doing so, it is the least disruptive to the current cultures. And then lastly, but maybe most importantly, we believe that this is based upon sound educational practices and research. So the committee recommendations were as follows. We would stay with the current grade configuration and are recommending to stay with a pre-K 5 neighborhood school concept and redraw district boundary lines to keep the current configuration of our 6 through 8 and also our 9-12 high school grade span. We also believe that the high school building enrollment in the future, because we want that culture to stay intact and we want to stay with a culture that would be no larger than 1,500 to 1,600 students within that high school building. We support the idea of building a freshman academy on the site of a second high school campus within the next 3 years for all district freshmen. So this can get confusing because the addition we're building now at the current high school, we're referring to the freshman academy, and that addition will be where the freshmen will be housed and educated in that part of the building. What we're suggesting is that when a second site for a future high school is selected, that all district freshmen would come to that site, and the current high school campus then would be for grades 10 through 12. We would also recommend middle school boundary changes for the 2021 school year and recommend boundary changes for 2021 for the elementary schools as well. We would also recommend elementary boundary changes for the second year or 21-22 school year when elementary 7 is able to be opened. Further recommendations that the committee is bringing to you as a board this evening is to build a third middle school, and again this would be consistent with the district's philosophy toward keeping a smaller school feel. We do have land that was purchased about 3 years ago at the southeastern and 69th. We as a committee are also recommending a bond referendum for October of this year for a new middle school and the initial phase of a second high school. That's the second phase is where we would bring all freshmen in the district into the site of a new high school, and only the freshmen would then be housed there for a number of years. What that we would foresee that looking like is that you would build only the classroom space to house the freshmen. It would include common area spaces for a second high school, for example, a full-size gym, a performing arts center, some common areas that would be necessary when it would become a full-fledged 9 through 12 second high school. This is a model that would be more efficient, it's more cost-effective for the taxpayer. I think it's important to state that we believe that we can do that without raising taxes, as we've been very fortunate for the last number of projects in the Harrisburg School District to be able to pass referendums without raising taxes due to the growth, and that is one area that we also believe at this point, just with running some initial numbers, that is a possibility as well for this project. The last recommendation on this slide is then we would then begin middle school construction in the spring of 2021 at Southeastern and the 69th location. Additional recommendations that we as a committee are bringing is that we would open the new middle school in August of 2022. We would also begin construction on the new freshman academy at the future location of a second high school in the spring of 2022, assuming numbers are what we are projecting them to be. And then lastly, on this slide, we would open the new freshman academy on the site of a future high school to be determined at a later date in the fall of 2023. As you remember, going back to that slide where we discussed the enrollment increase at the high school, that we would be over capacity at that time, even just rolling the current grades forward. So let's take a look at the actual boundary recommendations that the Boundary Committee will present to you this evening. The first slide is the current elementary zones as they are today. And this map and slide is on our website as well. But looking ahead, the changes that we are recommending in this next slide would be elementary year 1. The changes and the enrollments and how they would be impacted on the bottom left-hand corner would show the enrollments based on current students. And I think this is important to try and stop and explain at this point. The Guide K-12 software, you can roll grades forward, which we have done with the middle school options. That is not possible really with the elementary, because if you roll those grades forward, the incoming kindergarten classes for the next 2-3 years are really unknowns to us, and we don't have that data. We can't roll those kind of grades forward. So we are actually using the actual numbers as we know them today in grades K through 5 with the elementary zones. So that data is a little bit skewed, whereas the middle school data that I'll present to you later is actual data with our grades being rolled forward. So elementary year 1, the changes that we're recommending as a committee is, if you see in that northern part of the Endeavor zone, we are recommending the change from Endeavor to Journey of an area from Western and 85th going north to the Sioux Falls boundary, and then along 85th on the eastern boundary going from 85th north on Meredith to the Sioux Falls boundary. So that chunk that is currently in that neighborhood that is currently in the Endeavor zone would be we are proposing to go to Journey. Part of the logic behind this recommendation is that Journey neighborhood is starting to age up a little bit, and we don't project a whole lot of growth within that neighborhood and in that zone. And when you look south, there's not a whole lot of area that will be in the near future in the growth management map. And so we are trying to add additional students into the Journey district. Also, if you look on the west side of Louise, there's an area from Louise going west. On the southern boundary, it's in the backyard of 93rd from Louise to Hughes, and then going north all the way to 85th. So that neighborhood would all come into Endeavor in year 1. That's to recover some of the students that are being lost in the area we just talked about that would go from Endeavor to Journey. And then you can see the net result that also gave relief to Endeavor for next year to be able to get through next year. And then year 2 is in the following slide. Looking at year 2, and again, you can see the net result of current students. This is not rolling students forward again. But in year 2, this then reflects the opening of elementary 7. And there's one additional change in the in that area we were just talking about. That would be an additional change from Brett on the western edge, Hughes on the eastern edge, and going from 85th on the northern edge, and then on the southern edge from 89th. It's actually the backyards between 89th and 90th. That neighborhood would also then roll into Endeavor in year 2. Part of the conversation that was had by the committee and part of the logic behind bringing that in year 2, there's not room to bring that neighborhood in year 1 until the advanced program or the Tiger Reserve is moved to elementary 7 in year 2, and at that point Endeavor would drop considerably and open up quite a bit of additional space, and so we wanted to bring more students over from the Explorer Zone to Endeavor Zone for year 2. Another consideration that was discussed with the committee was a possibility of grandfathering and allowing 4th grade students to stay in their present zones for the coming year, giving them that option. However, if they had younger siblings, we felt that it was probably not in the best interest, and you could not grandfather the younger siblings, but for 1 year they could stay in that zone, as again, one of the goals is to minimize the amount of changes and transition that any student would have to go through. So you can see the numbers then in elementary, after elementary year 2. There's also a change. The Freedom, pretty much everything west of Freedom currently is in the Freedom Zone as we know it today, but most all of that would then come into elementary 7 for year 2 with the boundaries that are being recommended. Looking ahead to the middle school current count is on the next slide, which shows our current middle school boundaries. We are 806 at North Middle School, 441 at South Middle School. Looking at the next slide, this is a recommendation for the middle school that we would recommend bringing in, and this is for 6th graders, incoming 6th graders or this year's 5th graders. Pretty much everything in the horizon boundary, we are suggesting that the incoming 6th graders would go to South Middle School in 6th grade and 7th grade. We're currently at 860. If we were to just roll the numbers forward next year, we'd have 860 at North Middle School with not counting any kind of growth. With this recommended change, we would be at 801 in year 1 at North Middle School and 480 at South Middle School. In year 2, those numbers would be 748 at North and 539 at South. Part of the reason for this is the 4th grade class of this year, the current 4th grade class, is smaller in that North Middle School zone than the 5th grade class, and so the impact of the change would be greater in year 2. And again, if we did nothing, the numbers would be 860 for next year. By making these changes, it'd be 801 at North Middle School in year 1 and 748 in year 2. Looking ahead at that high school recommendation, you can see the slide here that kind of illustrates how we have currently the Harrisburg High School is a 912 campus. We would recommend that when the new freshman academy is completed, that all freshmen in the district would attend there. Until that time where we grew to a level that we would be splitting into 2 high schools. When West Fargo did this, they stayed as one freshman academy with all freshmen in the district attending that for about a period of 6-7 years. At that point, you would split. As a committee, we talked about that being around 550 up to 600 per class. It may be a number of years until we reach that. So if you were to look at those numbers, if you had 550 per class in grades 9 through 12, that would be 2,200 students district-wide, 9-12, and if you split into two high schools, at that point, you'd be roughly 1,100 in each high school. We're about 1,150 students at the high school currently, so that would be splitting to where we are currently at with the number of students when we actually do become two full-fledged 9-12 campuses. This would also allow you to operate a freshman academy in each of the 9-12 campuses, because the freshman academy is already built in with the new addition at the current Harrisburg High School, and we would then be able to do that. It also allows families to plan for when this may occur, and it also allows us to keep our current programming, current culture in place for the foreseeable future until we grew into that second high school campus. What is the board's role, and what will your responsibility be? At this point, this is simply recommendations that include kind of casting a vision of recommendation for the future, not only for the boundaries, but for a third middle school, keeping the grade configurations as they are, and then also a vision for how we can see a second high school in the future and growing into that, with that second site to be determined. At this point, what we would, as a committee, be asking the board to make a decision on is to really decide on the boundary changes in the near future so we can begin to address staffing. We are not asking you to make any decisions at this point on any bond referendum or the future of a third middle school or the high school, but rather these recommendations are really comprehensive and trying to cast an overall long-range planning vision. Those type of decisions would come after additional future board meetings and public meetings. We would also need more accurate, more detailed projections on what the costs would be before we would ever be able to take that to a vote of the public, and also for the board to be able to vote on these types of resolutions. As you know, tonight was really your first opportunity to see the comprehensive presentation. Even though I've tried to keep you informed along the way, this is your first comprehensive look to be able to digest this information. We have the two community engagement meetings that are scheduled for Monday, January 27th, and also Monday, February 3rd. And we will try and have this presentation and PowerPoint available on the district website as early as tomorrow.